some of the most beautiful moments happen when someone who's been broken chooses to heal another person's pain. The iridescent bubbles floated through the marble lobby of Harrison Industries like tiny rainbows, each one catching the afternoon light as it drifted toward a 6-year-old girl whose world had collapsed into sensory chaos 30 minutes earlier. Rashid Coleman knelt on the polished floor, his grey maintenance uniform a stark contrast to the corporate elegance around him, gently blowing stream after stream of soap bubbles toward Sophia Harrison. "Look, sweetheart," Rashid said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "See how they dance? Each bubble knows exactly where it wants to go, just floating along without any rush, without any pressure." Sophia's rigid body had begun to soften for the first time since her meltdown began, her desperate wailing gradually fading to exhausted whimpers as her visual system engaged with the gentle, predictable movement of the bubbles. Her small hands remained pressed against her ears, but her breathing was becoming less erratic with each passing moment. 8-year-old Amira Coleman sat cross-legged nearby, carefully blowing her own bubbles in slow, deliberate streams that complemented her father's technique. She'd seen this routine hundreds of times during the years when she'd accompanied her father to his classroom, back when he'd been a special education teacher instead of the night custodial worker he'd become 3 years ago. "Dad," Amira whispered, using the quiet voice they both employed when helping children in crisis. "Her shoulders are getting less scrunched up. That's good, right?" "That's very good, baby girl," Rashid replied, never taking his eyes off Sophia as he continued creating the calm, bubble environment that was helping her nervous system slowly regulate. "It means her brain is starting to feel safer, less overwhelmed." 43 floors above, Elena Harrison stood frozen at her wall-mounted security monitors, watching a scene that defied everything she thought she understood about her daughter's needs. For 3 years since Sophia's autism diagnosis, Elena had hired every specialist money could buy. 500 per hour behavioral therapists, 800 per session occupational therapists, 300 per hour speech pathologists who promised breakthrough communication techniques. None of them had ever calmed Sophia during a sensory meltdown as effectively as this janitor with his simple bottle of bubble solution. "Carmen," Elena said through her office intercom, her voice tight with emotions she couldn't name. "Who is the custodial worker in the lobby, the one helping my daughter?" Carmen Rodriguez looked up from her desk outside Elena's office, quickly accessing the security feed on her computer. "That's Rashid Coleman, Ms. Harrison. He's been with our night cleaning crew for about 3 years. Exemplary work record, always professional." Elena watched as Rashid gently encouraged Sophia to reach toward a bubble, his movements deliberate and patient in ways that reminded her of the most expensive autism specialists, except this man was achieving results she'd never seen before. The crisis had begun when Nancy Mitchell, Sophia's 200 per hour childcare specialist, had brought the little girl to Harrison Industries for what was supposed to be a brief visit before evening therapy appointments. But the corporate environment had proven too overwhelming for Sophia's sensitive nervous system. Fluorescent lighting that felt like fire against her skin, elevator bells that sounded like explosions, air conditioning that created unbearable pressure in her head. Nancy had tried everything in her professional toolkit: verbal redirection, behavioral rewards, sensory toys that had cost Elena thousands of dollars. Nothing had worked until Rashid had appeared with his maintenance cart and immediately recognized what Sophia needed. Not behavioral modification or expensive therapeutic equipment, but simple environmental modifications that worked with her neurology instead of against it. The bubbles moved slowly. Rashid continued his gentle narration, allowing Sophia to process his presence without feeling pressured to respond. No loud noises, no sudden movements, just peaceful floating that doesn't demand anything from us. This was the technique Rashid had developed during 12 years as a special education teacher, creating calm sensory experiences that helped autistic children regulate their nervous systems during overwhelming moments. He'd refined these approaches through work with hundreds of children, learning that autism required understanding rather than compliance, acceptance rather than modification. "Amira," Rashid said quietly, "can you blow some bubbles toward that sunny spot by the window? Sometimes the light makes them extra pretty." Amira moved with practiced ease, understanding her role in creating therapeutic environments that had once been her father's professional specialty. At 8, she possessed sophisticated knowledge about autism, sensory processing, and crisis intervention, education she'd absorbed during years of accompanying Rashid to his classroom during school breaks and teacher work days. "Dad," Amira whispered, watching Sophia tentatively reach toward a cluster of bubbles. She's starting to look around instead of just staring at the floor. Her eyes aren't as scared anymore. Rashid felt the familiar satisfaction that had drawn him to special education work, the moment when a struggling child began to emerge from neurological overwhelm through careful, knowledgeable intervention. These moments had once been his daily professional reality, before budget cuts eliminated special education positions in favor of cost-effective inclusion that provided minimal support to children with complex needs. "That's right, sweetheart," Rashid said, addressing Sophia directly for the first time since her crisis began. "You're doing such a good job letting your brain calm down. There's no hurry, no pressure, just you and the bubbles taking your time." Elena's throat tightened as she watched her daughter actually smile, a small, tentative expression that had been absent from Sophia's face for weeks, despite Elena's desperate attempts to find activities, therapies, or experiences that brought her joy. "Ma'am," Carmen said through the intercom, "should I call down to the lobby? Nancy seems like she wants to move Sophia upstairs, but Mr. Coleman appears to think she needs more time to stabilize." Elena found herself in the unprecedented position of trusting a janitor's judgment over that of the expensive specialist she'd hired specifically to manage Sophia's care. But the evidence was undeniable. Rashid understood her daughter in ways that professional credentials had never guaranteed. "Tell Nancy to follow Mr. Coleman's lead," Elena instructed, making a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour earlier. "He clearly knows what he's doing with children like Sophia." And being as Sophia gradually transitioned from crisis to calm engagement, reaching toward bubbles and even allowing herself a few cautious giggles when they popped against her fingertips, Rashid felt the bittersweet recognition of skills that remained valuable regardless of whether society chose to compensate or acknowledge them appropriately. "Nancy," Rashid said gently to the overwhelmed childcare specialist, "when Sophia is ready to move, we should give her a few minutes' notice and maybe carry some bubbles with us. Transitions can be challenging after sensory episodes, so maintaining some consistent calming input can help prevent regression." Nancy nodded gratefully, recognizing expertise she hadn't been trained to provide, despite her expensive education and professional credentials. "Mr. Coleman, how did you know what would help her? I've tried everything I learned in my pediatric development courses." "Different training," Rashid replied diplomatically, not wanting to diminish Nancy's efforts while acknowledging the specialized education required to work effectively with autistic children. Autism requires specific approaches that aren't covered in general child development programs. Elena, listening through the security system, made mental notes about the gap between expensive generalized childcare and specialized autism support that apparently existed in unexpected places within her own building. "Dad," Amira said, as Sophia successfully popped several bubbles and began attempting to blow her own, "should I tell her about the special bubble technique you taught me? The one where you blow really slowly so the bubbles stay together longer?" "That's a wonderful idea, baby. Why don't you show Sophia how to make bubble clusters? Sometimes sharing techniques helps children feel more confident about new activities. For the next 20 minutes, Amira patiently taught Sophia advanced bubble-blowing methods while Rashid monitored the little girl's energy levels and sensory regulation. The interaction was both therapeutic and naturally social, providing Sophia with peer connection that felt safe rather than overwhelming. Elena watched her daughter engage with another child for the first time in months, seeing communication and joy that had been absent despite thousands of dollars spent on social skills therapy and peer interaction programs. "Carmen, I want to meet Mr. Coleman," Elena said finally, her voice carrying the decisive tone that characterized her business decisions. "Ask him if he and his daughter would be willing to come upstairs once Sophia is ready to transition. I'd like to thank him personally." "Miss Harrison, are you sure? He's just a custodial worker, and you have the board meeting in an hour." "Carmen, that custodial worker just accomplished something with my daughter that every expensive specialist I've consulted has failed to achieve. I think 30 minutes of my time is an appropriate investment in understanding how that's possible." As Rashid helped Sophia practice standing up slowly and preparing for the transition to Elena's office, he felt the familiar mixture of professional competence and personal vulnerability that came from demonstrating skills that had once defined his career, but now existed only in moments of unacknowledged service. Some expertise, he understood, remained valuable regardless of whether it was officially recognized or compensated. But watching Sophia's transformation from crisis to calm joy reminded him why he'd chosen special education in the first place, not for status or recognition, but for the profound satisfaction of helping struggling children discover that the world could feel safe and manageable with the right support. The question now was whether Elena Harrison would see his intervention as isolated kindness or as evidence of capabilities that might benefit her daughter on a more sustained basis. Some moments, Rashid was learning, created opportunities that could transform multiple lives simultaneously if the people involved had courage to recognize value that existed in unexpected places. Elena's corner office felt different, with a 6-year-old's presence transforming its corporate sterility into something more human. Sophia had settled comfortably into the large leather chair by the window, still occasionally blowing bubbles from the small wand Rashid had given her, while Amira sat nearby demonstrating advanced bubble techniques with the patient expertise of someone far older than her 8 years. "Mr. Coleman," Elena began, studying Rashid with the analytical intensity she typically reserved for merger negotiations. "What you accomplished with my daughter downstairs was extraordinary. I've consulted with every autism specialist in Manhattan, spent thousands on behavioral therapies and sensory integration programs, and I've never seen Sophia respond to intervention the way she responded to you." Rashid remained standing near Elena's desk, still wearing his grey maintenance uniform, acutely aware of the incongruity between his current employment and the sophisticated therapeutic techniques he'd employed with Sophia. For 3 years, he'd successfully compartmentalized his lost teaching career, but Elena's directness was forcing him to confront capabilities he'd learned to keep hidden. "Ms. Harrison, every child with autism has unique needs and responds differently to various approaches. What worked for Sophia today might not work tomorrow, or might need modification as she grows and changes. Mim, that sounds like someone with extensive professional training rather than casual experience," Elena observed, her voice carrying the sharp curiosity that had made her legendary in corporate negotiations. "Nancy mentioned that you knew exactly what to do, used therapeutic language, demonstrated techniques she'd never seen before." Amira looked up from her bubble demonstration with Sophia, sensing the adult conversation was approaching territory that made her father uncomfortable. At 8, she'd learned to monitor situations that might threaten their family's stability, and questions about her father's background always carried that potential. "Dad used to be a teacher," Amira said with matter-of-fact directness, before they decided schools didn't need special education teachers anymore. The child's explanation was both protective and informative, offering Elena information while subtly defending her father against potential judgment about his current employment. "Special education," Elena repeated, processing implications she hadn't considered. "How long did you teach?" 12 years, Rashid replied, recognizing that further deflection would seem suspicious rather than modest. "I specialized in autism support, sensory regulation techniques, and crisis intervention for elementary-aged children." Elena felt something shift in her understanding of the morning's events. This wasn't a kindly janitor who happened to be good with children. This was a trained professional whose expertise exactly matched her daughter's needs, but who was working custodial jobs for reasons she didn't yet understand. "What happened to your teaching career?" The question touched the core of everything Rashid had spent 3 years trying not to think about. He looked at Amira, who was watching him with the supportive expression she used when adult conversations threatened to become painful, and made a decision about honesty that felt both necessary and dangerous. "Budget cuts eliminated special education positions in my district 3 years ago. The administration decided that inclusion classrooms with minimal support were more cost-effective than specialized programs with dedicated teachers. So they fired you? They eliminated my position and offered me work as a teacher's aide in general education classrooms, supporting 30 children with special needs instead of working intensively with 12. The pay was 60% of my teacher salary, with reduced benefits and no job security." Elena understood corporate cost-cutting strategies well enough to recognize the false economy of eliminating expertise rather than investing in effective support systems. "And you chose custodial work instead?" "I chose employment that provided stable income and health insurance that my daughter depends on. Single parenthood requires reliable benefits more than professional satisfaction." The pragmatism in Rashid's response reminded Elena that her wealth had always insulated her from the kind of practical decisions that shaped other families' choices about work and security. "But surely your qualifications would have made you competitive for positions at private schools or therapeutic centers." Rashid was quiet for a moment, weighing how much of his employment struggles he was comfortable sharing with someone whose life experiences were so different from his own. Private schools typically require teaching credentials from prestigious universities and prefer candidates without gaps in traditional classroom experience. Therapeutic centers often want master's degrees in specific fields, plus certification programs that require full-time enrollment I couldn't afford while supporting Amira. "What about public school systems in other districts?" "Special education positions are being eliminated nationwide, Ms. Harrison. Districts everywhere are replacing specialized teachers with general education staff who have minimal training in autism support but cost half as much in salary and benefits." Elena processed this information with growing anger at systemic failures she'd never bothered to consider. The same budget-cutting strategies she implemented in corporate environments were apparently destroying exactly the kind of expertise her daughter desperately needed. "So you became a janitor because it was the most stable option available?" "I became a custodial worker because it provided steady employment with health insurance, predictable hours that allowed me to be present for Amira's needs, and work that didn't require credentials I couldn't afford to update." Amira had been listening to this conversation with the serious attention she brought to all discussions about their family's circumstances. But now she spoke up with 8-year-old directness that cut through adult diplomatic language. "Ms. Harrison, Dad didn't want to stop teaching kids like Sophia. He loved his students and was really good at helping them feel safe at school. but nobody wanted to pay him enough money to take care of me properly. The child's summary was both heartbreaking and illuminating, revealing the personal cost of institutional decisions that treated specialized education as expendable luxury rather than essential service. Elena looked at Sophia, who had been quietly engaged with bubble play while the adults discussed autism education, and felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and guilt. Her daughter was receiving exactly the kind of expert support that had been eliminated from public education, but only through accidental encounter rather than systematic availability. Mr. Coleman, what would you do differently if you were designing Sophia's support plan? The question invited Rashid to return to professional mode, drawing on expertise he'd been forced to suppress for 3 years. He studied Sophia carefully, noting her current calm engagement, her sensory preferences, and the communication patterns he'd observed during their brief interaction. I'd focus on understanding her specific sensory profile rather than trying to modify her responses to overwhelming situations. Every autistic child has unique combinations of sensitivities and preferences that affect how they interact with their environment. Rashid moved to the whiteboard Elena used for strategy sessions, beginning to outline comprehensive autism support that reflected 12 years of specialized training. Sophia needs predictable routines with built-in flexibility, communication systems that don't require verbal language when she's stressed, and environmental modifications that prevent sensory overload rather than managing it after it occurs. For the next 40 minutes, Rashid conducted an impromptu consultation that covered sensory regulation, social communication, academic accommodation, and family support strategies. His recommendations were specific, evidence-based, and practical in ways that impressed Elena with their thoroughness and sophistication. This is exactly the kind of comprehensive planning I've been trying to get from Sophia's therapy team, Elena said, reviewing the detailed notes she'd taken. But their recommendations are always fragmented, focusing on individual symptoms rather than understanding her holistic needs. Most autism services are designed around insurance billing requirements rather than comprehensive child development, Rashid explained. Therapists are trained to address specific deficits instead of supporting the whole child's growth and family functioning. Elena realized that her wealth had allowed her to purchase expensive services that were ultimately inferior to the integrated approach Rashid was describing. Not because the individual therapists lacked competence, but because the system was structured around profit rather than effectiveness. Mr. Coleman, would you be willing to work with Sophia on a consulting basis? I could pay standard rates for autism specialists, and we could structure sessions around your current work schedule. Rashid felt his heart rate accelerate with the possibility of returning to meaningful work, but the offer also triggered anxiety about job security and family stability that had shaped every decision he'd made for 3 years. Miss Harrison, I appreciate the opportunity, but I need to be very careful about taking on responsibilities that might conflict with my custodial duties or jeopardize the stable employment Amira depends on. What if we treated it as supplemental income that enhanced rather than replaced your current position? Additional expertise that utilized your training while maintaining the job security you need? Before Rashid could respond, Amira approached with the serious expression she used for important family discussions. Dad, would this help you feel happy about work again, like when you used to tell me stories about students who learned new things in your classroom? The 8-year-old's question highlighted the personal cost of work that didn't utilize Rashid's capabilities or provide the professional satisfaction he'd once found in teaching. Some opportunities, Rashid understood, offered the possibility of reclaiming not just income, but identity that had been lost to circumstances beyond his control. The question was whether he had enough courage to risk the stability he'd built for the possibility of becoming Once again, the teacher, his daughter, remembered and admired. 3 weeks after agreeing to work with Sophia on weekends, Rashid sat in the break room of Harrison Industries at 11 p.m., reviewing session notes by the harsh fluorescent light that had become as familiar as his own apartment. His left knee throbbed with the persistent ache that came from kneeling on corporate marble floors during his custodial shifts, then spending hours in child-sized chairs during his Saturday consultations with Sophia. The transition back to education work had been more emotionally complex than Rashid had anticipated. Each session with Sophia reminded him of capabilities he'd been forced to suppress, dreams he'd abandoned, and the professional identity that had been stripped away through bureaucratic decisions rather than personal failure. "Dad," Amira said softly, settling beside him with homework she'd brought to keep busy during his shift. "Your sad face is back, the one you used to have when you first stopped being a teacher." At 8, Amira had developed sophisticated awareness of her father's emotional states, particularly the grief he carried about losing work that had defined his sense of purpose and competence. She'd watched him struggle through the transition from meaningful career to survival employment, and now she was witnessing the psychological complexity of returning to professional territory he'd been forced to abandon. "I'm not sad, baby girl," Rashid said, but his voice carried the exhaustion of someone managing competing emotional demands that stretched his psychological resources thin. "Just tired from working 2 jobs and trying to do both of them well." The additional income from consulting with Sophia had been substantial. Elena paid him $150 per hour for autism support, nearly 3 times his custodial wages. But the emotional labor of returning to special education work while maintaining his night-cleaning responsibilities was proving more challenging than Rashid had expected. "Is it hard to be around kids like that again?" Amira asked, with the direct curiosity she brought to all difficult topics. "Kids who need the kind of help you used to give all the time." Rashid considered his daughter's question seriously. Working with Sophia had reactivated neural pathways and professional reflexes that had been dormant for 3 years. But it also highlighted everything he'd lost when special education programs were eliminated. The classroom community, the systematic support, the ability to work with multiple children whose growth he could monitor over months and years. "It's not hard to help Sophia," Rashid said carefully. "She's a wonderful little girl who's making real progress with communication and sensory regulation, but it reminds me how many other children need this kind of support and can't get it because schools decided it was too expensive to provide." The conversation was interrupted by Elena's unexpected appearance in the break room, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the casual clothes that had become her weekend uniform since beginning to prioritize Sophia's needs over corporate social obligations. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Elena said, offering Rashid one of the coffee cups with the considerate gesture that had gradually replaced her initial corporate formality. "I wanted to discuss Sophia's progress and some complications that have developed." Over the past 3 weeks, Elena and Rashid had developed a working relationship that transcended their dramatically different social backgrounds. Elena's desperate need for effective autism support had overridden her usual comfort with hierarchical boundaries, while Rashid's professional competence had earned him respect that had nothing to do with his custodial employment. "What kind of complications?" Rashid asked, noting the tension in Elena's expression that indicated corporate rather than personal problems. "The board has been asking questions about consulting expenses that aren't going through traditional procurement channels. Someone noticed that I've been paying autism specialists without board approval, and they're concerned about precedent regarding personal use of corporate resources." Elena's discomfort was visible as she explained how her executive decisions were being scrutinized by people who didn't understand the difference between personal indulgence and necessary support for her daughter's development. They're also questioning whether it's appropriate for me to employ building custodial staff for professional consulting, given potential conflicts of interest and liability concerns. The implications settled over Rashid like cold water. His consultation work with Sophia wasn't just providing income and professional satisfaction, it was potentially jeopardizing his primary employment by creating corporate complications Elena hadn't anticipated. Ms. Harrison, I don't want my work with Sophia to create problems for either of us. If continuing the consultations threatens your position or my custodial job, maybe we should reconsider the arrangement. Rashid, absolutely not, Elena replied, with the fierce protectiveness she'd developed regarding Sophia's care. You've made more progress with my daughter in 3 weeks than 2 years of expensive therapy accomplished. I'm not stopping services that are actually helping her because of bureaucratic concerns. Amira had been listening to this conversation with the worried expression she used when adult problems threatened their family's stability, and now she spoke up with 8-year-old logic that cut through the adult's complex considerations. Ms. Harrison, what if Dad helped Sophia somewhere that wasn't your office building, like at a park or a therapy center where the board people don't make rules about who can work with kids? The suggestion was both practical and insightful, addressing the corporate conflict issues while preserving the therapeutic relationship that had been benefiting Sophia dramatically. That's actually a brilliant idea, Amira, Elena said, looking at the child with genuine admiration. We could meet at neutral locations that don't involve corporate resources or building employment conflicts. But Rashid recognized complications that an 8-year-old wouldn't anticipate. Ms. Harrison, meeting at external locations would require me to travel during weekends, when I also need to manage Amira's activities and household responsibilities. Single parenthood makes it difficult to accommodate flexible scheduling without affecting my daughter's routine. What if Amira came with us? Elena suggested. She's been incredibly helpful during sessions, and Sophia clearly enjoys her company. We could structure outings that work for both families, rather than just scheduling around Sophia's needs. The proposal was both generous and practical, but it also represented a level of personal integration that made Rashid uncomfortable. Elena's wealth and social position were dramatically different from his circumstances, and he worried about exposing Amira to lifestyle differences that might create dissatisfaction with their modest life. I appreciate the consideration, Rashid said carefully, but I want to be mindful about maintaining appropriate boundaries between professional services and personal relationships. Elena understood Rashid's concern, recognizing that their class differences created power dynamics that required careful navigation. But she also saw the genuine friendship that had developed between Amira and Sophia, and the benefit both children derived from their interactions. What if we started with occasional outings that benefit both girls, and see how everyone feels about the arrangement? No pressure to make it permanent, just experimenting with approaches that might work better than office-based sessions. Over the following month, weekend consulting evolved into family outings that served multiple purposes. Autism support for Sophia, social opportunities for both children, and professional collaboration between Elena and Rashid that transcended their different backgrounds. They visited sensory-friendly museums where Sophia practiced social skills while Amira learned about art and science through guided exploration she'd never been able to afford. They explored parks where Sophia worked on gross motor skills, while Amira discovered outdoor activities that weren't available in their urban neighborhood. "Dad," Amira said after a particularly successful afternoon at the Botanical Gardens, where Sophia had successfully communicated with a stranger for the first time. "I like helping with Sophia, but I also like how happy you look when you're teaching again." The observation reminded Rashid that his return to education work was affecting more than just his professional satisfaction. It was modeling for Amira the possibility of finding meaningful work that utilized your best capabilities, rather than just accepting employment that paid bills. Amira, do you feel like the time I spend working with Sophia takes away from time I should be spending with you? No, because I'm usually there too, and Sophia is becoming like my little sister. But Dad, I do worry sometimes that you're working too much. Between your night job and helping Sophia, you're tired a lot. Amira's concern was valid and concerning. Rashid had been managing 40 hours of custodial work plus 8 to 12 hours of weekend consulting, while maintaining single-parent responsibilities that included household management, homework supervision, and emotional support for his daughter. The physical demands were manageable, but the emotional labor of returning to professional work he'd lost was proving more exhausting than Rashid had anticipated. Each session with Sophia reminded him of the classroom communities he'd built, the students whose progress he'd never get to follow, and the career trajectory that had been permanently altered by institutional decisions beyond his control. "Elena," Rashid said during one of their weekend sessions, "I need to be honest with you about something. Working with Sophia has been professionally fulfilling in ways I hadn't realized I was missing, but it's also psychologically challenging to return to education work that reminds me constantly of everything I lost." Elena looked up from the notes she'd been taking about Sophia's communication progress. Recognizing that Rashid was processing grief she hadn't fully understood. "Are you saying you want to stop the consultations?" "I'm saying that I need to figure out how to balance the satisfaction of meaningful work with the emotional difficulty of being reminded that this kind of work isn't available to me as stable employment." Some returns, Rashid was learning, required confronting not just practical challenges, but psychological territory that had been too painful to fully process during his initial career transition. The question was whether the benefits to Sophia, the income for his family and his own professional satisfaction were worth the emotional complexity of reconstructing an identity that circumstances had forced him to abandon. 2 months into their unconventional partnership, Elena found herself in territory she'd never imagined navigating. Sitting on playground equipment at Riverside Park, taking notes about Sophia's social progress while watching her daughter actually play with other children for the first time in her life. Rashid sat on the adjacent bench, monitoring both Sophia and Amira with the practiced awareness of someone trained to recognize subtle changes in children's emotional states. His professional observations about Sophia's development had evolved into comprehensive understanding of her needs that surpassed anything Elena had obtained from years of expensive specialists. "Look at that," Rashid said quietly, pointing toward the sandbox where Sophia was successfully sharing toys with 2 other children, while Amira served as a patient social mediator. 6 weeks ago, Sophia couldn't tolerate the sensory input of sand between her fingers. Now she's using it as a communication tool with peers. Elena felt the profound satisfaction that came from witnessing her daughter's genuine progress rather than therapeutic exercises that demonstrated compliance without meaningful development. Under Rashid's guidance, Sophia had begun developing authentic social connections, functional communication strategies, and sensory regulation skills that enhanced her daily life rather than just managing crisis situations. "Rashid, I've been thinking about something and I want to run an idea by you," Elena said, her voice carrying the tentative tone she used when approaching topics that might be sensitive. "What if we formalize this collaboration into something more comprehensive than weekend consulting?" Rashid looked up from his observation notes, immediately alert to potential complications that might affect his carefully maintained balance between meaningful work and family stability. "What kind of formalization are you thinking about?" "I've been researching autism education programs, and I've learned that most families can't access the kind of individualized support you're providing Sophia. What if we created something that could help more children while utilizing your expertise in a sustainable way? Elena had spent weeks investigating special education services, discovering the same systematic gaps that had cost Rashid his teaching career, while leaving thousands of families without adequate support for their autistic children. "I'm listening," Rashid said carefully, "but I need to understand how any expanded arrangement would affect my current employment and Amira's security." What if we established an autism support center that provided services to multiple families while offering you full-time employment with benefits comparable to what you had as a teacher? The proposal was both generous and complex, addressing Rashid's professional capabilities while acknowledging his need for job security and family stability. But it also represented changes that would affect every aspect of his and Amira's established routine. "Elena, that sounds like a significant financial investment and organizational undertaking. Are you certain it's something you want to commit to long-term?" "Rashid, in 8 weeks you've accomplished more with Sophia than 2 years of traditional therapy. But more importantly, you've helped me understand that autism support requires specialized expertise that's been systematically eliminated from public education and inadequately provided through private services." Then, Elena had been conducting her own research, discovering that autism specialists with Rashid's training were increasingly rare and valuable, while demand for effective services continued growing as diagnostic awareness improved. There are hundreds of families in this city who need exactly the kind of support you're providing, Sophia, but they can't access it because autism education has been treated as expendable luxury rather than essential service. Amira had been listening to this conversation while continuing to facilitate Sophia's playground interactions, and now she approached with the serious expression she used for important family discussions. "Dad, are you and Ms. Elena talking about you getting to be a real teacher again, the kind who helps kids like Sophia in a special classroom?" "We're talking about the possibility, sweetheart. But it would mean big changes for our family, and I want to make sure any decisions we make serve your needs as well as Sophia's." Elena watched the exchange between father and daughter, recognizing the mature partnership they'd developed through years of navigating economic uncertainty and career challenges together. "Amira, how would you feel if your father's work with Sophia became his main job instead of something he does on weekends while also working nights?" Amira considered the question with 8-year-old seriousness, weighing factors that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of family dynamics and financial realities. "Would Dad be happier if he could help kids like Sophia every day instead of cleaning offices? And would we have enough money for our apartment and my school supplies?" "Yes to both questions," Elena replied. "Your father would be working as an autism specialist, and the salary would be higher than his current custodial wages, with better benefits for your family." "Then I think it sounds good. But Ms. Elena, what happens if you get tired of spending money on the autism center? Would Dad lose his job again, like what happened at his school?" The child's question revealed awareness of employment vulnerability that shaped all their family's major decisions, and it forced Elena to confront the responsibility she would be accepting by creating career opportunities that other people would depend on. "Amira, that's a very important question," Elena said, appreciating the 8-year-old's practical concerns. "I would structure the Autism Center as a permanent organization with multiple funding sources, not just my personal investment. That way, your father's job security wouldn't depend entirely on my decisions." Over the following weeks, Elena and Rashid developed a comprehensive plan for the Coleman Autism Learning Center, a facility that would provide individualized education services, family support programs, and professional training for educators interested in autism specialization. The center would serve 15 to 20 children initially, Rashid explained to Carmen Rodriguez, who had become Elena's closest collaborator in developing the organizational structure. Small enough to maintain individualized attention, large enough to create social learning opportunities and sustainable operations. Carmen had been researching non-profit education organizations, learning about licensing requirements, insurance obligations, and regulatory compliance that would be necessary for operating an independent autism support center. Elena, the initial investment would be substantial. Facility costs, equipment, staff salaries, insurance, and operating expenses for at least the first 2 years before enrollment revenue could support operations. Carmen, I've spent more money on individual art pieces than it would cost to establish comprehensive autism services that could benefit hundreds of families over the coming decades. This isn't expense. It's investment in addressing systematic gaps that affect people like Sophia. But Rashid remained concerned about the personal and professional risks of transitioning from stable employment to organizational leadership that would require skills he'd never developed. Elena, I have expertise in autism education and therapeutic intervention, but I've never managed a non-profit organization or supervised professional staff. Running an education center requires administrative capabilities I'm not sure I possess. Rashid, you wouldn't be managing the center alone. I would handle organizational leadership and business operations while you focused on educational programming and direct services. We'd be partners in developing something neither of us could create independently. The partnership proposal addressed Rashid's concerns about administrative responsibilities while recognizing that successful autism services required both his specialized expertise and Elena's organizational capabilities. There's something else to consider, Elena continued. Establishing this center would provide Amira with educational opportunities and social connections that might not otherwise be available to your family. She could participate in programming designed for siblings of autistic children, access enrichment activities, and benefit from the resources we'd be developing. As they finalized plans for the Autism Center, both Elena and Rashid understood that they were creating more than educational services. They were building a professional partnership that transcended their different backgrounds, while serving children and families who had been systematically underserved by traditional institutions. Elena, Rashid said as they toured potential facilities for the center, I want you to know that this opportunity means more to me than just returning to meaningful work. It means being able to use my training to help children like Sophia while providing Amira with stability and opportunities I never imagined we could access. Rashid, what you've taught me about autism support has changed, not just how I parent Sophia, but how I understand the responsibility that comes with having resources that could address systematic problems affecting vulnerable families. Some partnerships they were discovering created opportunities for individual growth while addressing institutional failures that harmed entire communities of families seeking support their children deserved but couldn't access. The question now was whether their collaboration could survive the practical challenges of establishing a new organization while maintaining the therapeutic relationships and family stability that had made their alliance successful. 6 months into planning for the Coleman Autism Learning Center, Elena faced the most hostile board meeting of her corporate career, surrounded by executives who viewed her autism advocacy as evidence of compromised leadership and misplaced priorities that threatened Harrison Industries' profitability and focus. Elena, declared board chairman Richard Pemberton, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone prepared to remove a CEO who had strayed from acceptable corporate behavior, we need to address your recent decisions regarding company resources, time allocation, and what appears to be an unhealthy obsession with your daughter's medical condition. The conference room was packed with board members, senior executives, and legal representatives who had been systematically documenting Elena's erratic behavior over the past 6 months, her reduced work hours, her consultations with custodial staff, her research into autism services, and her plans to invest personal funds in educational programming they viewed as emotional indulgence rather than strategic investment. "Richard, my daughter's autism is not a medical condition that requires cure," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "It's a neurological difference that requires understanding and support, which I've been learning to provide through consultation with qualified specialists." "Qualified specialists?" interrupted board member Helena Morrison, producing documents that painted Elena's relationship with Rashid as evidence of poor judgment and boundary violations. "You've been employing a night janitor as an autism consultant, paying him $150 per hour for services he's not licensed to provide, and now you're planning to invest millions in an education center based on his recommendations." The attack was comprehensive and strategically designed to portray Elena's autism advocacy as the desperate actions of an unstable parent whose judgment had been compromised by guilt and emotional desperation rather than improved by education and understanding. "Furthermore," Helena continued, "your obsession with this autism project has coincided with decreased attention to corporate responsibilities, missed board meetings, and reduced profitability in 3 of our major divisions." The accusations were technically accurate but deliberately misleading. Elena had indeed prioritized Sophia's needs over some corporate obligations, but Harrison Industries remained profitable and competitive under her leadership. "Elena," Richard said, his tone carrying the false sympathy that preceded corporate executions, "we understand that parenting a disabled child creates emotional stress that can affect professional judgment. The board is prepared to provide you with extended leave to address these personal issues while we arrange interim leadership." The suggestion was both insulting and threatening, characterizing Elena's autism advocacy as emotional breakdown, while positioning the board to remove her from CEO responsibilities that she'd handled successfully for over a decade. Before Elena could respond, the conference room door opened to admit Rashid, accompanied by Carmen Rodriguez, and a woman Elena didn't immediately recognize. "Ms. Harrison," Carmen said, her voice carrying the protective authority she'd developed after 8 years of managing Elena's professional challenges, "I apologize for the interruption, but Mr. Coleman has information that the board needs to hear before making any decisions about your leadership." "This is highly irregular," Richard protested, clearly displeased by the unexpected appearance of people he'd categorized as subordinate staff. "Board meetings are not appropriate venues for custodial workers to address executive decisions." "Mr. Pemberton," Rashid said, stepping forward with the calm authority he'd learned during 12 years of advocating for children in hostile educational environments, "I'm here as Dr. Rashid Coleman, licensed autism specialist and former public school teacher, to address misunderstandings about my qualifications and the services I've been providing to Ms. Harrison's family." The revelation that the night janitor held advanced degrees and professional credentials immediately shifted the dynamic in the conference room, forcing board members to re-evaluate their assumptions about Elena's judgment and Rashid's expertise. "Additionally," continued the woman, Elena now recognized as Dr. Sarah Chen, Director of Autism Services at Columbia University Medical Center, "I'm here to provide the board with information about the Coleman Autism Learning Center that Ms. Harrison and Dr. Coleman are developing. For the next hour, Dr. Chen presented research demonstrating the desperate need for quality autism services, the scarcity of qualified specialists like Rashid, and the potential social impact of the educational center Elena was planning to establish." The Coleman Center represents exactly the kind of innovative programming that addresses systematic gaps in autism support, Dr. Chen explained, displaying data about service availability and family needs that validated Elena's advocacy efforts. Dr. Coleman's expertise combined with Ms. Harrison's organizational capabilities could serve as a national model for autism education. But Elena Harrison was prepared for professional validation of Elena's project, having researched potential criticisms of autism services that could undermine board support for Elena's continued leadership. Dr. Chen, regardless of the social value of autism programming, our concern is whether Ms. Harrison's personal investment in this project represents appropriate use of executive time and corporate resources. Ms. Morrison, Elena said, standing to address the board with confidence that came from months of learning about autism advocacy and her own capabilities as both parent and executive. I want to clarify something about my priorities and performance. Elena distributed quarterly reports that demonstrated Harrison Industries' continued profitability and competitive positioning despite her increased attention to family responsibilities. Over the past 6 months, while learning to support my daughter's needs and developing expertise in autism services, our company has maintained market leadership, increased employee satisfaction, and improved client retention rates. The data was compelling and directly contradicted the board's narrative about Elena's compromised professional performance. More importantly, Elena continued, I've learned that effective leadership requires understanding how to support people with different needs and capabilities rather than expecting everyone to conform to traditional expectations. Elena looked directly at Richard Pemberton, her voice carrying the authority she'd developed through months of defending her daughter's needs against institutional resistance. The same autism advocacy that you're characterizing as distraction has actually improved my management capabilities by teaching me to recognize individual strengths, accommodate different working styles, and create inclusive environments that utilize everyone's best contributions. The confrontation was interrupted by Sophia herself, who appeared in the conference room doorway with a mirror, both children having been brought by Carmen as part of a strategic demonstration Elena had planned for exactly this kind of attack on her fitness as both parent and executive. "Mommy," Sophia said, using clear verbal communication that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. "Amira and I finished our project about different kinds of families. Can we show the business people?" The moment was both innocent and profound, Sophia demonstrating exactly the kind of development that Elena's autism advocacy had supported, while addressing board members as peers rather than authority figures to be feared. "Of course, sweetheart. Would you like to tell everyone about what you learned?" For the next 10 minutes, Sophia and Amira presented their collaborative project about family diversity, neurological differences, and the importance of understanding people's individual needs rather than expecting everyone to be the same. "Some people's brains work differently," Sophia explained to the room of executives with the matter-of-fact confidence that had developed through months of autism-affirming education. "But different doesn't mean wrong. It just means we need different kinds of help to do our best." The presentation was both educational and strategically powerful, demonstrating Sophia's remarkable progress while highlighting the value of the specialized support that Elena's advocacy had made possible. "Mr. Pemberton," Elena said after the children finished their presentation, "the choice before this board isn't between corporate success and family responsibility. It's between leadership that recognizes and develops human potential versus management that wastes valuable capabilities by making assumptions about people's limitations." The board vote that followed was closer than Elena would have preferred, but it represented validation that growth, innovation, and inclusive leadership were legitimate corporate priorities rather than personal indulgences that compromised fiduciary responsibility. Richard Pemberton's attempt to remove Elena from CEO responsibilities was defeated, but not before establishing that some board members would continue questioning leadership approaches that prioritized long-term human development over short-term profit maximization. As the meeting concluded and board members filed out with varying expressions of support, skepticism, and grudging acceptance, Elena remained with Rashid, Carmen, and the two children who had inadvertently become advocates for autism acceptance and family-centered leadership. "Elena," Rashid said, as they prepared to leave the corporate environment that had nearly cost Elena her position, "I want you to know that defending our work together was one of the most meaningful professional experiences I've had since losing my teaching career. Rashid, what we've built together isn't just about autism services or corporate leadership. It's about proving that people's value isn't determined by their current circumstances, and that the most important innovations come from recognizing capabilities that exist in unexpected places." Some confrontations, Elena realized, were less about winning specific battles than about establishing principles that would guide all future decisions about what mattered most in both professional and personal contexts. 2.5 years after Sophia's first meltdown in the Harrison Industries lobby, Elena stood in the sunlit main classroom of the Coleman Autism Learning Center, watching her 8-year-old daughter lead a group discussion about sensory preferences with 6 other autistic children whose families had found the specialized support they'd been desperately seeking. "Remember," Sophia said with the patient confidence that had developed through years of autism-affirming education, "everybody's sensory system is different. What feels good to me might feel uncomfortable to you, and that's perfectly okay." Elena felt the profound satisfaction that came from witnessing not just her daughter's remarkable development, but the thriving community that had grown around Rashid's vision of comprehensive autism support that honored children's differences rather than attempting to eliminate them. The Coleman Autism Learning Center had exceeded every projection Elena and Rashid had developed during their initial planning. 23 children between ages 4 and 12 attended daily programs that combined individualized education, social skills development, sensory regulation training, and family support services that addressed the holistic needs of autistic children and their families. "Dr. Coleman," called 10-year-old Marcus Williams from across the classroom, "can you help me explain to the new student why I need my weighted blanket during story time? His mum looks worried that it means something's wrong with me." Rashid approached the family with the gentle expertise that had made him legendary among parents who had struggled for years to find professionals who truly understood their children's needs. At 41, he carried himself with the confident authority of someone whose specialized knowledge was both recognized and valued. "Mrs. Peterson," Rashid said, addressing the concerned mother with the respectful tone he used with all families navigating autism acceptance, "Marcus uses his weighted blanket because deep pressure input helps his nervous system organize sensory information more effectively. It's not a sign of problems. It's an accommodation that helps him participate more successfully in group activities." Elena watched Rashid work with families, recognizing how much both of them had grown through their collaboration. Her corporate leadership had been transformed by understanding autism advocacy, while his autism expertise had been enhanced by Elena's organizational capabilities and resources. "Mommy," Sophia said, approaching Elena with the easy affection that had replaced the anxious distance that had characterized their relationship before autism-affirming support. "Amira and I want to show you the presentation we made for the parent meeting tonight." At 10, Amira had become something between Sophia's best friend and an informal autism advocate, helping other neurotypical siblings understand how to support their autistic brothers and sisters. Their friendship had developed into genuine sisterhood that transcended their families' different backgrounds. "What's your presentation about?" Elena asked, settling into one of the child-sized chairs that had become as familiar as her corporate boardroom furniture. "It's about how families can be created in different ways," Amira explained, with the sophisticated understanding she'd developed through years of witnessing her father's work and Elena's transformation. "Some families are related by genetics, some by adoption, some by marriage, and some by choosing to care about each other." The presentation covered family diversity with wisdom that reflected both girls' experiences growing up in an environment where differences were celebrated rather than hidden. Elena realized that her relationship with Rashid and Amira had indeed created family bonds that transcended traditional structures. "We also want to talk about how kids like Sophia can teach neurotypical people important things about patience, creativity, and noticing details that other people miss," Sophia added, using the academic language she'd learned through autism-positive education. As the afternoon program concluded and families gathered for pickup, Elena reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that first encounter with Rashid in the corporate lobby. She still served as CEO of Harrison Industries, but her leadership style had been permanently influenced by understanding accommodation, individual differences, and the importance of recognizing capabilities that existed in unexpected places. "Elena," Rashid said, approaching with the comfortable familiarity that had developed through years of professional partnership and personal friendship, "I wanted to discuss the funding proposal from the Department of Education about expanding our programming model to other cities. The Coleman Center had attracted national attention as an innovative approach to autism education that combined individualized support with inclusive community building. 3 university research programs were studying their methods, and 5 cities had requested consultation about establishing similar programs. "What's your instinct about expansion?" Elena asked, recognizing that Rashid's professional judgment had become as valuable to her as any corporate consultant she'd ever employed. "I think we have an obligation to share what we've learned, but I want to make sure we don't sacrifice quality for growth. Every autistic child deserves the kind of individualized attention we provide here, but that requires careful training and ongoing support for educators." Elena appreciated Rashid's commitment to maintaining high standards rather than pursuing expansion that might dilute the specialized services that made their program successful. "Dad," Amira said, joining their conversation with the ease of someone who had grown up participating in discussions about autism, education, and organizational development. "Mrs. Chen from Colombia wants to know if you'll speak at the conference about autism and employment. She says companies need to learn how to recognize valuable skills that might not look traditional." The invitation reflected Rashid's growing recognition as an expert in autism advocacy and inclusive education practices. His story of transitioning from custodial work to professional leadership had inspired other organizations to examine their assumptions about employee capabilities and potential. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Rashid asked Amira, acknowledging her role as his closest advisor on decisions that affected their family. "I think you should do it. Other kids might have parents with hidden talents that nobody recognizes, just like Elena recognized your teaching skills." As they prepared for the evening parent meeting that would showcase student progress and discuss program expansion, Elena realized that her family had been transformed in ways she could never have imagined when she'd first watched Rashid calm Sophia with soap bubbles. "Rashid, can I tell you something?" Elena said as they organized materials for the presentation. "Always. Adin, 3 years ago, I thought successful parenting meant providing Sophia with every expensive resource available and expecting her to adapt to neurotypical expectations. You taught me that effective support means understanding her individual needs and creating environments where she can thrive as herself." Elena paused, looking around the classroom where children with different neurological profiles worked and played together with mutual respect and support. "But you also taught me something about leadership that changed how I approach corporate management. The most valuable expertise often exists in people whose current circumstances don't match traditional expectations about professional capability. Elena, what you taught me is that resources and advocacy can create opportunities for people whose talents have been systematically overlooked. The Coleman Center exists because you were willing to invest in services that matter more than they profit." As the parent meeting began and families gathered to celebrate their children's progress, both Elena and Rashid understood that their collaboration had created something larger than autism services or corporate philanthropy. They had built a community where differences were accommodated rather than eliminated, where individual capabilities were recognized and developed, and where families found support that honored their children's authentic identities rather than demanding conformity to narrow definitions of success. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rashid addressed the room of parents whose children had flourished through autism-positive programming, "tonight, we're celebrating not just individual student progress, but proof that every child can thrive when provided with understanding, accommodation, and educational approaches designed around their strengths rather than their challenges." Elena watched families whose lives had been transformed by access to specialized support, recognizing that her investment in autism services had created benefits that extended far beyond her own family's needs. 6 months later, Elena stood in the playground behind the Coleman Center, watching Sophia and Amira teach bubble-blowing techniques to a group of newly enrolled students, while Rashid monitored their interactions with the practiced expertise of someone whose professional identity had been fully restored. "Mom," Sophia said, approaching Elena with the easy confidence that had replaced her previous anxiety and sensory overwhelm, "Dr. Rashid says that next year I might be ready to help teach younger kids about sensory regulation. Would that be okay?" The question reflected Sophia's remarkable development from a child who couldn't tolerate social interaction to someone eager to share coping strategies with peers who needed support. "Sophia, I think that sounds like a wonderful way to use everything you've learned about understanding your own needs to help other children." As Elena watched her daughter return to her friends with excitement about future teaching opportunities, she realized that autism advocacy had given Sophia not just better support, but purpose and identity that celebrated rather than concealed her neurological differences. Some families, Elena understood, were created through shared commitment to values that transcended traditional boundaries. Like the bond between her, Rashid, Amira, and Sophia that had grown from professional necessity into genuine love based on mutual respect and shared dedication to autism acceptance. The Coleman Center continued serving families whose children needed specialized support, but it had also become proof that recognizing hidden capabilities could transform individuals, families, and entire communities when approached with patience, resources, and genuine commitment to human flourishing. The end. This story reminds us that expertise and compassion often exist in unexpected places, and that the courage to recognize talent, regardless of someone's current circumstances, can transform not only individual lives, but entire communities. In a world that frequently judges worth by job titles and social status, Rashid and Elena's journey shows us that the most meaningful partnerships are built on shared values and mutual respect rather than similar backgrounds. Sometimes the most important teachers are those whose wisdom has been overlooked by systems that prioritize credentials over competence. And the most valuable investments are those that serve human development rather than just financial returns. What hidden talents are you overlooking because they don't match your expectations? What communities could you serve if you had the courage to recognize expertise wherever it exists? Like and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the power of seeing people's potential rather than their limitations, the importance of autism, acceptance and neurodiversity, and the truth that the strongest families are created through choice, understanding, and shared commitment to each other's growth.